From the Center for the Study and Teaching of Writing, this is Writer's Talk. I'm Doug Dangler. Erin McGraw, professor of creative writing at Ohio State University, is the author of 5 books, including Good Life, Lies of the Saints, and her latest, The Seamstress of Hollywood Boulevard. Welcome, Erin, to the Writer's Talk studios.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Great. Let's start with your most recently published book, The Seamstress of Hollywood Boulevard. This follows 20 plus years in the life of its heroine, Nell Presser, and it takes place from around 1900 to 1924.
That's right.
Here. What was your elevator talk while you were writing this book? What was your short way of describing it?
I'm writing a book based on the life of my scandalous grandmother.
Oh, good. I was hoping that you would invoke the word scandalous because there are some of the actions in here are scandalous for the time. They're pretty much what everyone does now, but everyone who's having a lot of fun, who's not old and married. But so how did you explain it after that part? What was your more detailed talk?
I hate to give away all of the turns in this thing, but the initial scandal was that she ran away from her family. She abandoned her children.
And so without giving away what happens in the book, are the things that happen in the book really reflective of the life? How much creative license could you take with it?
Quite a bit. The first part of the book stays pretty true to my grandmother's experience, and then, but she did wind up in California making her living as a seamstress, but she didn't work in Hollywood, even though she was there during that very glamorous time, and she didn't go on to have some of the adventures that occur to my character Nell in the second part of the book. And in fact, the end of her life wound up being very quiet and kind of sad, so that didn't make good novel material.
Right, yeah, it's only the painful parts that you bring back
there you
up
go.
that are good. Now, you say in the epilogue that you learned about, based this on a lot of the stories that your parents had told you about your grandmother. You never got to meet her.
Oh, I did.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
We didn't talk about those early days, ever. She would come to our house for holidays, and I remember her as a kind of quiet presence, chain smoking and drinking bourbon in the living room while my mother and I were making Thanksgiving dinner.
So a traditional grandmotherly figure.
Who had no interest in children, just none. If I could have an adult conversation with her, she was interested, and otherwise she was not about to ask what happened at school that day.
Okay. So was your the part about the child abandonment, was your mom one of those? Or?
No, actually it was my father's mother, but he didn't. I wrote him out of the book, I'm afraid. He messed up my pattern, and so he didn't wind up in the book.
Okay, so there are the pattern of women working with or against women in the book.
That's right.
Which is fairly clear because I think almost all of the important characters are, most of them seemed to be women in it. I mean, there were a couple of other characters. She works for somebody who's a woman who's got a big influence on her, sort of not a positive influence ultimately. But some of the other people are come in and out of the story are men. I was waiting for her husband from the first part of the book to make a return.
I always kind of wondered, but he seemed perfectly content for her to be gone away, and nobody knows what happened to him.
Oh, really?
He might very well have divorced her because he had grounds, but things were fairly slipshod. They were out there in the prairie. It was the very beginning of the 20th century. There weren't a lot of records being kept.
Right. I was thinking that as I read through this book that I've actually made a comment to somebody. There were no databases in 1900. Nobody would know. How would you find out if somebody married a second time? You'd have to go to that courthouse.
That's what you would do.
And it reminded me of the scene in with Jack Nicklaus in, Jack Nicholson. We're in Columbus, so I'll say it was Jack Nicklaus. In Chinatown, where he goes to the records store office and starts ripping things out of books and coughing to cover it. That's how you would get out of being married to somebody previously. So how did you work out the character then? What led you through knowing your grandmother? Where did you start to veer from it? What did you think was fair or not fair? Or is it just, I'm going to take this clay from my childhood and mold it in whatever ways that work best for the novel?
That's a complicated question. I knew that the beginning of my grandmother's life was just a really good story. I've been telling it at dinner parties all my life. It's a good story. So that part, just in terms of narrative, I knew I didn't need to mess with. And I also knew that there was a drastic falling off after around 1930 in real life, and that was where I would have to meddle. So just the editorial part of my brain understood that much. In terms of where I made a character who's different from the grandmother that I knew, and that kind of came from language itself. I had in my mind a certain kind of voice that I was going for, and the voice was tough and self-aware and kind of funny, and that defined the character.
You know, it reminded me also as I was reading it, the voice of the character is not the sort of warm and fuzzy kind of character.
No,
and it reminded me of Nellie on Little House on the Prairie, because they're sort of contemporary, and Nellie, you know, she's not nearly as spoiled or anything as Nellie, but she had that same sort of, you know, I'm very independent, and I'm going to be doing what I want to do, which includes, you know, eventually leaving the one person. Although, as you described the marriage, you can certainly see that either of them might have had grounds.
Well, yeah, I don't cast any blame here. I think that this is a very realistic portrait of a certain kind of marriage in a certain time and place. That being said, I had to figure out a way to make a reader understand why a woman would do something like this. And she isn't a monster. She's just trying to save her own life.
And you know, I felt funny about it because as I was reading it, I didn't... I fell into the sway of the narrator enough that it wasn't until somebody else said, what a monstrous thing to do, to leave your children, because you recognize, you know, it's sort of coming, and it didn't occur to me as a monstrous thing. I'm like, well, you know, that'd be kind of an awful life. And as you say at some point that Kansas comes in for a bit of abuse in the book, and so I didn't even think about that because I was just following the narrator through. Did your parents read the book?
Yeah, they did.
And what did they think about your takeoff on your grandmother's story?
Well, they both have been wonderfully supportive, just tremendously. They've been great. My father was out of his mind with excitement that I was writing this book, and he didn't care a bit that I was hanging out fairly unseemly family laundry. He was really excited about it, and he died 2 days before the book officially came out. He was 88 years old. And he'd read it twice, once in manuscript, once in galleys. But that was hard. That was hard that I wasn't able to put a copy of the book in his hands. But I have gotten kind of messianic about it, partly as a result of that. And when I give readings, I start out with a shout out to my dad.
Okay. Well, that's great. What was the reaction of the character? He liked the book? Did he say, you really captured my mother in the beginning, or this isn't anything like her?
He didn't bother to say this isn't anything like her. We all knew this was not. This was somebody that I made up. But he didn't hold it against me that I wrote him out of the book, which I thought was handsome of him. Yeah. And he said I got the details right. That was worth a lot. Right.
Because there are a lot of details in this book that I imagine required a lot of research, unless you were, you came into the world knowing about textiles, sewing, Hollywood in the 1920s. What kind of research did you have to do for this?
Less than you think. But before I got to serious writing, I read a couple of books, sociology books mostly, about the period, so I could get a feel for what was going on culturally. And then after that, an awful lot of it I just did ad hoc. I would stumble up against a detail that I needed right that minute in that scene, and I'd go and look it up. And so I spent a whole lot of my writing time, wandering around the web trying to find out what year paved surfaces came to Kansas, stuff like that.
So you didn't learn to sew?
I did not learn to sew.
That's too bad. Because you hope that everybody, I always assume that an author walks away from a book with some new skill, right, that you've researched and maybe done. Your next book will be on boating.